Oh, hey, CNFers. Happy Halloween. It's that Atavistian time of the month, magazine.atavist.com. So you got some spoilers ahead. Man, I wish I could write for the Atavist. Listen to this episode, if you dare. Monday, November 10th, if you're in Eugene. I'll be delivering a little lecture for the U of O History Pub to kick off the series this year. It's at 6:30 p.m. at World Pies, and it will be my now world-famous annotated reading, among a couple other things. Come on down, get a slice of Zabra, and get fucking hammered as I talk about the front runner again.
It's very easy to glamorize stealing art, because that's everybody's predisposition. But I did think about him as a craftsman.
Oh, it's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I talk to tellers of true tales about the true tales they tell. Today, we feature Jack Rodolico, who is a bit of an audio maven, but he comes to us hot off the Atavist presses to talk about the Blue Book Burglar. The Social Register was a who's who of America's rich and powerful, the heirs of robber barons, scions of political dynasties, and descendants of Mayflower passengers. It was also the perfect hit list for the country's hardest working art thief. It's a fun, rollicking read. It's not too heavy. It's not really heavy at all. Not really heavy. Merely a great caper. Show notes of this episode and more at brendanamaro.com. Hey, there. You can peruse for hot blogs and sign up for my two very important newsletters, the flagship Rage Against the Algorithm and Pitch Club. Welcome to pitchclub.substack.com. New Pitch Club drops November 1st. It will feature Tracy Slater's pitch letter to a literary agent that landed her representation for her book Together in Manzanar. Also, if you care to support the podcast with a few dollar bills, y'all, visit patreon.com/CNFpod. Batting leadoff is lead editor Jonah Ogles. Yeah, he's back. Yeah, we got Sayward last month, and now Jonah's back in the saddle. So we talk about his side of the table, about what less experienced writers can learn about pitching the Atavist, and how Jonah worked with Jack to fix the structure of this piece. As always, it's really rich stuff getting the editor side of things. I'll read more about Jack and give him a better fleshed out introduction before we hear from him, after we hear from Jonah. Let's cue up the montage.
I kind of hate it when people say that writing is fun.
But every day is very much a pair of socks.
And I love style. Don't get me wrong, but that style had better be adding something.
Yeah, this could be good.
This is going to have to interest somebody somewhere other than me.
How many stories do you like to have assigned, or it for you guys feels comfortable, okay, you're not scrambling for a story because you're like, oh shit, and in 2 months we're the well's dry.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunately that happens sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like the sweet spot is to have 8 to 10 assigned out.
Yeah.
Because things just come up. Even though we try, we're not like some magazines where, I remember working it outside and it was okay, we can assign this, but it has to be in the August issue, so that's part of the conversation with the writer is, can you turn this in by 6 months before that so that we have time to do everything. And at the Atavist, it's much more about making the story the best it can be, and so when things pop up and a writer says, hey, this source is tied up for a few months, can I have more time? We basically always say yes, and so even if we've done a good job of making sure we have a story or two coming in each month, things happen and they shift. And if we have 8 or so assigned, it seems like generally one will come in time. But if it dips below like 6, then we sort of start reaching. That's when we do more reach out to writers that we've worked with or whose work we've admired and say, what are you working on? What are you excited about? Is there anything that might work for us? And try to do our own digging for ideas.
Yeah.
And generally, there's usually like 1 or 2 promising ideas every 2 weeks when we meet to talk
Nice.
about
Yeah.
pitches, and of those, once we're engaged in that back and forth, I think the odds go up a little bit, but it's still, maybe 25% of those actually get assigned.
Mm-hmm.
But there are usually a couple that we're like, okay, this has some of the right stuff. Let's see if we can better envision what's going to happen, and like, is the sourcing lined up? And so it's a steady stream of decent ideas that come in, I think.
Yeah. And if someone is relatively inexperienced and doesn't have a big body of work, what do you like to see from that person in their pitch?
Well, yeah, we're paying attention to the writing in the pitch for sure, especially for younger writers who don't have a ton of clips. It's important that that's pretty tight and really reads like a first section of a story in places. And beyond that, I think what we're looking for is, and I'm struggling to talk about it because part of it is like a gut feeling. We want to be excited by the idea, but we're also like, I pay a lot of attention to how I feel after I read responses to my questions versus how I was feeling before that, because like if I'm like, oh, this person's kind of stumbled onto something good, I'm pretty intrigued, here are my questions. And then I'm more excited when they come back, or it seems like, hey, they're kind of thinking about this the same way I am.
Nice. Yeah.
Then I feel like we're like, this is, we're gaining traction on it. But if they come back and I'm like, oh, that is not what I wanted to hear, if my expectations for the story kind of lower, that I'll often ask follow-up questions even a second or third or fourth time. But if my excitement is diminishing, the more I learn about their reporting or what sources are available or what kind of memory the sources have and how they'll be able to flesh out the types of scenes we want. If I'm not feeling great about it, then we start to say, okay, that's not quite right. But hopefully, we feel that good energy between everybody, and we don't like, we know that like we can get a draft and rewrite it if we have to, so like, we're not that we want to do that. That's never the goal. But if a writer is new or kind of early career, we're not afraid to take a chance on them if it seems like all the ingredients are there.
Nice. And with Jack's piece here about this art heist and this little band of criminals here, what excited you about this pitch and this story when it came across your desk?
Yeah, well, it's fun in the first place, like it's a crime story where there's not like a bunch of dead bodies and a bunch of like real darkness. So that's always great for us. And also, like, he has spent like 7 years with this story, almost maybe 8 years now, reporting it, talking to Ray, the sort of the main character in it. And when you have somebody like Jack who's got some experience, knows what he's doing in terms of storytelling, and he's spent a bunch of time on the story, and it's just kind of fun to read, or is the right type of story for us, that makes it really easy. This was one of those that came in and we read it and we were like, yeah, this could be good. Like, we have a couple of questions, but as long as his response isn't like, I don't know, and how dare you ask, like, we're probably going to just assign this.
Yeah, well, bringing up the point of like no darkness and dead bodies, I was thinking too about why we really are enamored with art thievery, over the years. Michael Finkel wrote a great book, The Art Thief, that came out a couple years ago, which was a great, it was just a great book. And I wondered, just, for you, what do you feel is the appeal of, art thievery?
There's there's some cunning involved, like it's not so many crime stories, either like a person is really like severely twisted or maybe like the story we did where a guy in Minnesota like murdered a neighbor who he was worried was gonna assault his child. Those types of stories, well, in addition to the darkness, it's just sort of like, here's a terrible thing that happened, so we're going to write about it. But art stories are different because, I mean, I know there are victims in the story, and there are people who felt unsafe in their homes after their homes were robbed of all this incredibly valuable stuff that they had. But like they're not physically harmed.
Yeah.
They're well insured, I'm sure, because it's all old money people. So it allows you to like get into the natural like plot that a crime story has, but there's this person, the criminal in those stories is somebody who's like spending a lot of time casing things, figuring out how they're going to get in, how they're going to get out. So there's more of like a psychological thriller aspect to it without any of that the dark stuff.
Yeah, there's an Ocean's 11 kind of vibe to it.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. It's more, I don't know, maybe there's something in all of us that like thinks I'm smart enough, I could, could I pull that off or something like that. Yeah, there is something about them. I'm clearly not doing a great job explaining what it is, but there's something about art stories that just makes them fun.
Yeah, and as you, as the lead editor of this piece, what was the experience of, building it out? How did you build this out with Jack?
Yeah, it was really fun. Jack is a really great writer to work with. He has a good. He's funny. Like writing funny is really hard, and Jack is good at it. And he was super collaborative. We talked on the phone maybe a little bit more than is usual, but I don't mind that at all. Like it was always great to like get on the phone and kick things around. And in terms of like the editing process on this, like it wasn't, there was no major like issue that we had to address. It was all just kind of like conversations about maximizing what we wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think we held meeting Ray a little bit later in the story than was in an initial draft. We sort of got into Ray's background and revealed that he was the guy behind so many of these crimes pretty early in the piece. And so we moved that lower to just sort of like drag out the tension of not really knowing who he was, leaving some mystery. And otherwise I did a lot of trimming. I think I cut maybe, I don't know, 5,000 words or so out of the story. Wow. So it took about a third of the story out of it. But, that stuff is all, that's not really heavy lifting. It was really more of a process of like getting on the phone, talking about how I was responding to the story, hearing whether or not that resonated with him, and then making like some minor shifts and cuts in order to just get it to be as fun a read as we could make it.
And after the first section or the lead, and then there's a page break, and then Jack's like, I came across the Greenwich case in 2017, so there's this first person insertion, right, high up in the story. So, how did you guys arrive at that as part of the story and the storytelling?
Yeah, well, if I remember correctly, that initially came at the very end of the story. Although that I could be wrong on all of this, they kind of blur together. But I'll say that I think for a lot of writers, their impulse is to do that at the end, because they've got all this great reporting, they've got all this great material, and then they sort of reach a point where they have reached out to the character, and they're going to finally do the sit down interview. And I think that can work fine sometimes. My feeling is that it's almost always better to introduce yourself earlier in the piece if you're going to do that, especially like in an Atavist length piece. Because I think if you're writing a 4,000 word story and you don't appear until the final 1,000 words, readers have spent maybe half an hour, less than half an hour getting to that point, so it's not jarring in the way that it is in an Atavist story where you've read maybe 10,000 words and then the writer appears. I think at our length, you want to seed it early, like, hey, I'm here, I'm going to be part of this, here's my background. And that allows us to, in the last section, or maybe the second to last section, bring Jack back in, and readers already know who he is, what his voice sounds like, all of that type of stuff.
And in newspaper parlance, a lead is usually that first graph, and in longer magazine pieces, I guess the lead can be 500 words or 600 words, or an entire lead section. So how do you define leads as it pertains to these longer form narrative pieces?
Yeah, I tend to think of them as a first section, basically. And I think we often end up sort of putting the nut graph at the end of that first section. Like we like to start, or maybe just I do, I like to start with scenery and just drop readers into detail and color right away, because it just feels like a good way to get them, fully engaged with the story. And then you can kind of back up and say, here's what this story is about. But I think in this story, like that, what I would call a nut graph or maybe a lead is, it might be like 2 sentences at the end. That like, he wasn't done robbing the homes of the ultra rich, not even close. But that's the story. It's almost like a second deck for it. Hopefully that has created enough tension for us to then back into Jack and take a step back and say, here I am as a writer. This is how I encountered this case. And here are sort of my bona fides that make me an expert enough to be able to call this guy the hardest working art thief in America, which is kind of what that helped sell the idea too. Like it's not just a crazy art heist story. It's an art heist story where the guy behind it robbed hundreds of homes, like hundreds of homes, and spent like cumulatively maybe like 4 years in prison over a 50-year career as a criminal stealing high value stuff, or being accused of stealing high value stuff. He was only convicted, I think, in a couple of cases. Getting Jack's bona fides, I think, helped us make that argument.
Awesome. Well, I think it's about time we kick it over to Jack and talk to him about how he went about this piece. So as always, Jonah, it's so great to get your side of the table. So we'll kick it over to him. And as always, thanks for the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brendan.
Sweet. That's cool. Love talking to Jonah. All right, so a bit more about Jack Rodolico. The dude's got it going on. His work has appeared in the Boston Globe, NPR, 99% Invisible, and NHPR, that's New Hampshire Public Radio. He's earning an MFA in fiction, and that's really helping him with his nonfiction writing, as you'll hear in a moment. You can learn more about Jack at his website, journalistjack.com. In this conversation, we talk about his Atavist piece, obviously, writing fiction, earning trust, why you can't pay sources for information, how he organizes his research and cites his work, beginnings and endings, and how he didn't necessarily want to be a journalist, rather he wanted to be a writer, something I could really attest to. Really cool stuff. Why don't you just buckle up, maybe get your dirty dishes ready, or leash up that animal, okay? You're about to spend some time with Jack Rodolico. Fiction. So what might be the impetus to getting into more imaginative writing?
So I think that when I go back to like wanting to be a writer, maybe 20 years ago, I didn't tell myself like I want to be a journalist. I thought I want to be a writer. And journalism became very practical. I was interested in it. It was also the only way I could imagine getting a job as a writer. And so I did that, and I loved it, and sometimes loved it, sometimes, enjoyed it. I've had a good career as a journalist and got into narrative and audio, but then I got laid off. And the market changed a lot, and I was like, I have wanted to write fiction for a long time. I tried to on my own. And, I think you get to a point where you realize, at least I do, where it's like, I want to do this, and there's things about it that I don't know how to do. Like, I think this could be better. I think there's stuff that I just do not know about the craft of writing fiction versus anything else. So getting laid off is a good prompt to, try something new. And so that's what I did.
Nice. Yeah. Similarly, when I was in undergrad, I added journalism as a major and stayed an extra year. So I stayed 5 years at UMass Amherst, and I didn't necessarily want to be a journalist. I wanted to be a writer too. And I'm reading Susan Orlean's Joyride, her new memoir that's out, basically about her writing and journalism career. And when I talked to her about it, I've had her on the pod a few times, but it's like in the book, she doesn't want to be a journalist either. She just said she wants to be a writer, writing nonfiction or magazine. She came up in a definitively different and more lucrative era in journalism than you and I have. But she was able to parlay her writing skill into a living. But that was kind of a similar ethos. Like, yeah, we want to tell stories and write stories, but being a reporter or something wasn't really the goal.
Yeah. And I've found that I'm such a better writer having done over a year now in an MFA program and just like pounding out 30 pages of fiction. I'm not saying I'm like a brilliant fiction writer, but just the writing and sentence structure and how to land something. It's just that practice, and it gets you thinking a little differently about point of view, for example. Like in this piece, I had never really considered point of view before, because as a journalist, everything is third person, or at least it's supposed to be. And it immediately, thinking about fiction and point of view, right? So point of view is first person, I, me, third person, he, she, they. And as a journalist, innately, it's supposed to be third person, right? And that represents that distance you're supposed to have. But that doesn't always work because we have our biases. And especially in audio, you do wind up getting a little bit more I focused, or in a longer magazine feature, when I spoke to so-and-so. That alone really kind of blew my mind, because there's this kind of illusion in journalism that you are not there with someone. And everyone in journalism kind of knows that's not entirely true, and we have our biases, but it is the way we're trying to present it. So as it applies to this piece for the Atavist, I had this idea that I wanted to sort of start in third person and slowly work into first person as I went, because a lot of it sort of, there's the story of the caper, and the heist. And so that really starts out with the burglars did this, the detectives did that. And by the end of it, my goal was really to meet Ray Flynn, the burglar. And that became much more about the experience of interacting with him and trying to convince him to talk. But I do think that thinking about being a fiction writer has informed the way I write to such a great degree that I'm so appreciative of.
That's really really astute, and that's something I want to noodle with too. Just you're just fucking around with fiction in a way. Be like, oh, like this degree of interiority that we can maybe just imagine in fiction. Like, all right, well, what are maybe the questions or interviewing techniques that maybe we can push up against that interiority in nonfiction? Be like, oh yeah, like can I, what sensory details can you kind of tease out in the interviewing process to maybe get there as best you can in nonfiction? So that's, I imagine fiction helps push you into that space more.
Yeah. I mean, I still love the fact checking process, because if it's true, it should be true, and you don't want to. Yeah. So much of the fact checking is like finding these little things that you realize, like, I don't really know that, do I? So let's just get it out so we can all feel better about it. And you don't want to misrepresent somebody. And then on the opposite side, like I'm writing a novel right now in the first person about a journalist, and it's so great to just be in his head and be he's like a judgmental prick. And it's so liberating to sort of to portray that in a journalist, because journalists are super cynical, and because you see a lot of stuff and you are thinking all kinds of things that you should not put in your writing as a journalist. So yeah, I guess I still like doing both. I like being able to sort of be the journalist and get it right and tell a good story, and also trying out this new thing of I don't have to pretend any of this is real.
You said a moment ago about the gradual revealing of you in first person, your Atavist story. And, in the story, you have the opening section or lead, but then you come into the story pretty high up. And when I was talking to Jonah, he said, you were kind of trying to withhold that first person for a bit in earlier drafts. So what was the dialogue that you guys were having to get you higher up in the story?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was Jonah's idea, to bring that higher up. I think the idea was there is something very unique about this art thief and this string of crimes, and that's my opinion. And it's an informed opinion, but I'm not remotely some sort of leading expert on art crime, but I've read a lot, and I've talked to a fair number of people. And what was really unique about it was how it ran against all the cliches about what an art heist are. I mean, you think about the Louvre robbery a couple weeks ago, right? That is the movie image we all have in our minds of breaking into a big museum, taking something, really irreplaceable, and it disappearing, and all the cloak and dagger and stuff like that. Typically, from what I learned, that's an incredibly stupid way to steal art, because the whole world is looking for you. So it was sort of my opinion that this story was unique and different because this art thief stole hundreds of low value paintings. I think of the way an art heist is quote successful is, or any robbery. It's do you get away with it? Do you get the stuff out without getting caught? And then do you sell it? Do you make money from it? And steal a big painting, good luck selling it, because who's going to want it, But this guy, there was a success rate to what he did by getting small thing. So to go back to your question, I think Jonah's impulse was right, that bring that up earlier, because what's really so special about one home burglary? Or maybe even a bunch of them. I mean, sure, there's a cat and mouse chase to it, but it was helpful to get my opinion and my thought process and the sort of the research I've done up higher to make it clear, hey, at least I'm the writer, I'm in the driver's seat here, right? And I think this is unique. So that's maybe enough of a hook to get people going through.
Yeah, what do you think it is about art thievery that is so arresting to us as readers?
That is such a good question. People get so excited. I mean, you think about any other kind of robbery, people don't respect it, I mean, they're really if somebody hijacks your car, or breaks into your house or whatever. Like, that's not something that people think is very romantic. But art is this thing that you're not supposed to touch, period. And there is a reverence about it. And so the audacity of somebody taking something like that, I think there's also like a really clear classist element to it. Most people, myself included, we didn't grow up in homes with original artwork on the walls. And the sense of art is like, a Christie's auction or a museum of fine arts where everything is just not very accessible. This is a rich person's world, typically. And so there is something about somebody breaking into that world and grabbing something and disappearing that people get pretty psyched about. I've talked to people about the Louvre thing in the last couple of weeks. People who I know have been working on this story for the Atavist, they're like, when I heard about the Louvre heist, you're the first person I thought of. Just like, thank you, I guess, But they say things like, well, they kind of deserved it, didn't they? And I was like, I don't know. Did they? I've really thought about it a lot. And people with Ray Flynn, who's the thief at the center of the story I did for the Atavist, people immediately assume that he was like a Robin Hood figure, that he did not see himself that way at all. It was totally practical. It was a scheme. He had no objections to rich people. And also, like, he would be totally comfortable talking to somebody, who is from a totally different economic status, right? A different class from him. So I think it's that class thing. I think it's like, you're not supposed to touch it, and also sticking it to the rich.
Yeah, on your website, and talking about, getting, telling true stories and earning trust among your sources. How do you cultivate that sense of trust, in general, but then maybe specifically to this piece, how you're able to, lobby someone like a Ray Flynn to go on the record and talk, as challenging as he was to deal with? How do you cultivate that trust?
I have never had a source like Ray. Never. Typically you get to a point where you realize someone is either interested or not. And if they're not, they've got a really clear reason. It's like it doesn't benefit them, or it was something that was very personal, or they have strong feelings about. You build that trust by showing up again and again, by giving people time to get to know you before you turn a recorder on, by being yourself and not being phony, and like chit-chatting too about their life, just making the same way you'd make any acquaintance and build some trust. But with Ray Flynn, like, I don't know. It was like, I did all that stuff, but he just didn't see what was in it for him to be recorded. And he's a very pragmatically minded person in that sense. It's like his lawyer said, like, Ray rhymes with pay, and you're not going to pay a source to do a story. And that was kind of it for him, and I had all these editors and journalists over the years being like, tell him it's his chance to get his story out there and to clear the air. And it's like, he does not care about any of that. It's like, if I would show up with cash, he would talk for as much time as I asked him, but that's not what you're going to do. And in a way, I just have to respect that. It's like, that's his line. And yet, if I get him on the phone, like, I think I don't know if he trusts me or not. That's not really for me to say. But I do get a sense that, like, he'll chat with me a little bit. And every time we chat, I get a little bit more, And so that became the strategy over time. And doing it as a written story, when I finally decided, screw this, I'm not trying to do this as an audio story or as a big podcast. I had this whole vision at one time to do like a true crime podcast about it. And I even like sold it to a podcast production company, so, like, sold on paper, right? Had a contract, and Ray backed out at the last minute because he wasn't going to get paid. And I had always kind of felt like this would be a better magazine story anyway, because I knew so much about him, but only from a paper trail. And if you can't get someone to sit down and tell you their whole life story for something like this, you can't do an audio story. And in a way, it's almost more true to him to kind of slowly bring him out of the shadows on his, really kind of mostly on his own terms. that felt a little more true to what actually happened here.
Yeah, that gets to a point I wanted to bring up with you is having such a body of work in audio, and then here's this 10,000 word magazine story. Essentially, it's just like, what is the math you're doing? Like, okay, or on the spectrum, like, oh, this could be, it's better written versus audio, but it sounds like it started as audio, but as he was a bit more reticent to go on the record voice wise, it made sense to make that transition, right, to more written.
Yeah. So yeah, the number one thing is getting people on tape. And this was a story that I could get the primary investigators on tape, but I didn't think that would be a great audio story just from their perspective. Ray just would not go on tape, and that was that. So that was weighing against the audio. The other thing, though, that really weighed for writing it is that there were so many great details. When you do an audio story, you lose tremendous amount of detail. You have to write, in a much more simplistic, just sentence structure, noun verb, subject object, and you just lose a lot of detail because it washes past the ears, and you have to be really conscious of that. And so I had so many documents for this story with these great tiny details that I knew if I could kind of collate all of them and sort them out, it would just be packed with all of these really interesting facts. Like, can I give you one example from the story? There's a section where I explain what the thieves stole and who they stole it from. And it's like a couple paragraphs. Originally, it was twice as long. Jonah smartly kept encouraging me to cut it down. But every one of those sentences needed sometimes upwards of 5 or 6 sources, because what I had was a police report with the victim's name and what was stolen, and an insurance appraisal that might be 10 pages long. So I'll go through the insurance appraisal and find the most unique, interesting thing, like a pair of handheld fans owned by an emperor, a king of France or an emperor of France, and then I would take the name of the person. So I had a list of the most interesting items, and then a list of the people. And then I took the people, and I don't know these people's names, off the bat. And then I would start looking for their obituaries. And it's like, oh, this guy was the chairman of the board of directors of the National Audubon Society. This person actually was a Rockefeller. Her middle name now is Rockefeller. So I had to make all those connections and then line them up with the stuff that was stolen, right? So that's how I found out this, I don't even remember what it was. Something was stolen from a descendant of an investor in Thomas Edison's light bulb. So that, anyway, all of that would get lost in an audio story. It would just be way too convoluted to explain. Yeah. But on paper, you could really lay it out and build a case as you go.
You were talking earlier about how Ray wanted to be paid, and it's not uncommon for some sources to feel like, well, what's in it for me? Why don't you pay me for this information? I know when I was reporting for the Front Runner, my Prefontaine biography, there was one particular couple who knew Prefontaine in high school, and they insisted I pay them, and I didn't. I was just like, that's off limits. You can't do that ethically. Jeff Pearlman's written about this in his newsletter about a lot of sources in his reporting on Tupac would, definitely ask for money, and it's a line you can't cross. So I was hoping maybe you could just articulate why. There might be a good chunk of people in the audience who know why, but for those who might be unsure why, why don't we want to pay sources for information?
Because it undermines your own credibility. Let's say you pay a source. I mean, you basically wouldn't work again if it came out, as a journalist. But the reason behind that is it really undermines your own credibility. Maybe the source is totally truthful, and that's what they feel like they need to talk. It still means inherently you can't trust it, because they've got this motivation. It's kind of the same reason you can't totally trust someone who takes a plea deal to get out of extended prison time and then, testifies against somebody else. It's like they have a clear motivation to talk publicly, which is, in this instance, money, or in that instance, less time in prison. So it means you can't inherently trust them. And it also kind of just reflects poorly on you. Like, what else are you willing to do to get a source to talk?
Yeah, because you can, say you pay someone $100 and you want to go back to them and be like, oh, it's $500 now. And then if they start talking to other people and be like, oh, yeah, you paid him for that. Like, well, I want money now. It's like you're totally compromised in that way.
Yeah, it's like a house of cards.
Yeah.
This talking to Ray, though, did get me comfortable even having the conversation, because, it's just such a it's like blasphemous. It's just like, well, we can't do that. We can't do that. And you can't. Yeah. But that doesn't mean you can't entertain a conversation with a source about, like, okay, so you want to make money from your story. Okay. Like, first of all, there's states where that's illegal, where people can't, like, get paid later on to do a movie for a crime they committed. But some places that's perfectly legal. So, why don't you work with me to get your story out there, because nobody knows it, and then maybe you get a book deal down the line. I don't know. Like, I have no control over that. Yeah. It's not for me to say. But if that's what you want, I can't give it to you. Talking to me might get you a step there. Just being able to talk about that was interesting. That was new for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and they can, and the one source who threw it back at me, they were just like, well, you're making money from this, aren't you? I was like, well, and so that was the thing. How can you make money off of this and we can't? And I was just like, well, I'm not making that much, but I understand your point that, yeah, of course I am on some level benefiting financially, but that's my job. That's just the nature of this.
Yeah, it's like people might have an idea. It's like, oh, you're going to get rich off my story.
Yeah.
It's like, no, I'm not. I will not get rich off of your story. Believe me.
Yeah, on an hourly basis, I made more as a janitor in college than I'm making on this book right now. Trust me. Well, you bring up all those citations, which has made it for a better, like, to your point, like a better read than it would be for a listen. And in the draft that I had, I just see the extensive amount of research and work you did, which is just really impressive for, like, kind of a nerd like me when it comes to this kind of stuff. I have my way of citing as I write to make sure I don't lose track of these things. But as you're, laying out your materials and writing, how are you thinking of the citation and the citation as you're writing to make sure you're not losing any material?
Yeah, it's a lot before you start writing.
Yeah.
There's so much to do before you sometimes I'll have like a turn of phrase in my mind and have a place where I put that kind of thing. For this story, what I had was paper files. Like one or two bankers' boxes of paper files that I knew were going to have to go to a fact checker eventually. So it was like, step one, digitize all of them and label them in a way that's like organize them chronologically, right? So then once I had that, which was massive, I could see a story in them just by going from one to the next. I created a timeline in a Google Doc. It's probably 20 pages, maybe more. I really don't remember. I haven't looked at it in a while. That's just like first thing, second thing, third thing. So as I found new things, I could put them in the proper place, and I would link back. I also made a massive spreadsheet of the name of every single victim, of every single crime, of every single suspect, and every cop, like with different tabs. And I would drop the source in that. This was like compulsive in a way that I've never worked, actually, this particular story. I really needed to do all of that legwork for this one because it was this massive paper, that I had these source documents that were a shorthand to digging through all of these things. And because they were old, I couldn't even like word search on them.
Yeah.
It was just this sort of photocopy. So basically I made these massive source documents that nobody really generally looked at but me. The fact checker probably did. So that I had a really organized handful of documents that I could refer to. And then once I had that, I could start writing.
The thing that's always a challenge with an Atavist story, because they're so long, is the matter of pacing. And so how are you thinking of the pacing of this story as you're generating those pages?
So let me give a quick example. This was maybe 4 or 5 years, about 5 years of law enforcement actively looking into these guys until they were arrested. And then, eventually there was, they went to court. And it wasn't until I wrote down the timeline that was like, oh, there's a 2-week window in here that deserves a blowout section. Like, this is where this whole investigation came together. And so a lot of other stuff, it just becomes kind of, the writing is a little more breezy, in terms of like, they were here, they were over there, they took this, they took that. And then in this section, it gets really microscopic. Like, the FBI undercover agents watch them do this, and then that, and then this. So I think for the pacing, that's what an editor helps you do too. We Jonah and I agreed on a structure. It seemed like it felt right. Then you get, deep into the weeds of like a 11,000 word draft, and it's a fucking mess. There's like whole sections in the middle that are like, I think we're going to do this here. But I don't even know how to start it. So, and then as you have something that, for me, as with this story, is when we got something that felt more linear, then it was like, where's the pacing not matching the rest of the pacing? Yeah. Where is it just like, this is a drag to read, so how do we get through this faster?
Yeah, and you've alluded to it a bit already about the timeline, but I think for whatever project that we might be working on, a long magazine thing, a book, memoir, whatever, just how important is it to have a timeline in place?
I guess it probably depends on the story, but pretty damn important. You need to have a sense of everything that happened, even when you're going to be telling just a fraction of what actually happened. You really have to understand as much as you possibly can, so that you can textualize it right. You don't want to be in a place where you're writing towards things that you don't really understand. And so this allows you to pick, of all the things you can't know everything, right? So of all the things you do know, what pops out as the most obvious things to really dive into? I think that it kind of helps you contextualize the timeline. Yeah, I think it's really important. I'll do it on projects that are not as involved as this one too. I generate a lot of documents and spreadsheets that are really just like become my working memory until I get to that place where I'm drafting and then redrafting. And it's weird how much I wind up getting memorized. It's like I actually know what page of what document I can find that thing on. And then I start bypassing my my timeline and my spreadsheets. But I need that repetition, to memorize it.
Yeah, those redundancies are really helpful. I found that to be true with the Prefontaine biography I did, just having various things that just made it sticky in my head. But like, oh, okay, like I know, I might not know exactly where something was published or something, but like, oh, I know it was in 1973. So I can go there and, in my central nervous system spreadsheet, like I'll put some keywords so I know how to search something out and be like, okay, I have a pretty good idea of where this thing is. And those redundancies really help me be like, okay, I can zero in, I can make the bullseye a bit bigger in that way.
Hold on a second. I want to pull up my timeline. I haven't looked in a long time. How long is this thing? Yeah, 17 pages. It's just full. It's like I haven't looked at it in a while, but I totally needed it. In those early drafts, that's when I really needed it, was the early drafts.
This is a story that you've been with for a long time. And how much research had you done before you realized that there was something there, that there was a shape taking place, that you felt confident there was a good arc here, and the patience it takes to kind of stick with that research, really?
To be perfectly honest, like I knew that there was a good story from the very first interview I did, like the very first conversation, because there was one news piece online after these guys were arrested in 1982. There was a name of one cop in there, a detective from Greenwich, Connecticut. I got him on the phone. He was like, I got some records for you, and it was really kind of that. I didn't understand the scope of it necessarily, but it was one of those stories that it made sense as a narrative right away, because it was a slow burn of these thieves using the social register to target the richest of the rich, one house at a time. 1, 2, 3, like up to hundreds of them. So I think I knew that early, but as far as like when I knew there was a big, I don't know, it's been 8 years. Like this is something I would like pick up and put down and pitch, and sometimes get accepted and then realize like, I don't really want to do it for this place, or like it fell through, so my timeline's a little screwy, Yeah.
Yeah, that's good to. I like hearing people talk about that because we might get a good idea, and sometimes we are just like prematurely like jump the gun and try to pitch it before there's enough meat on the bone to even sustain something of this ambition. But then there's always the the ups and downs, or maybe you pitch it here like you said and it was accepted, but then it's like, nah, I don't know if it's right for you, and you really roll with it, but you're still tethered to it in a way. And then just through time and patience, you put it aside, it comes back to you, and you're like, oh, I just found the perfect place for it. I got the right document, it unlocked the door, and it's like suddenly you can really dive in whole hog. But it takes a lot of patience. It's really, that's a challenge, I think, in this kind of work, especially if maybe you're ambitious and hungry to do this kind of storytelling.
I think, it's funny because we're talking about it now, it's making me remember, I was really cautious in not using too much of my time if I didn't need to. Yeah. So there's only so much work you have to do to write a good pitch. There's a lot more work you have to do to then execute the story. You have to know that it's a story, right? But you don't have to do all of the reporting, and you're not writing the story, you're writing a pitch, right? So for example, like I had all of these files, these paper files. I never digitized them until I signed a contract with the Atavist. So like all of the pitches earlier than that, all of the places that I had discussed doing this story with, I did not bother because I knew it was going to be a lot of work, and I hadn't signed a contract and decided to do it. So there's a line there, right, where you got to budget your time and figure like, I could be obsessed with this and I could do this just for myself, but that's annoying. I don't really I want to do it so people can read it. So like, be careful,
And when you're setting down to write, what is your, what are things you like in place? How you to access your materials, the coffee you like to drink, just the rituals and the routine by which you're like, all right, I've got a block of time to commit to this. What do you like to have in place?
I like to be here in my office. I have a standing desk and a kneeling chair. My body is not, like writing is terrible for your body. And honestly, just pulling back, like if I haven't slept well and if I'm not exercising regularly, like that shit really matters. Like it really matters to be in the right headspace. So I try to be good about those things because I know it actually does make me a better person and a better writer too. But then once I get in here, it's like, yeah, like I've got a big screen. I hate writing on a laptop now. It's terrible for my shoulders and you can't see enough. So I like to have a big wide screen where I can like have the document that I'm writing in the middle. And if I have stuff I'm referencing, it's in the, the sort of the side panels, because it can get really inefficient if you can't see everything you need. Yeah, so I like to basically set myself up visually and physically in the space in a way that I'm ready to work. as far as the writing goes, it's like I got to be able to do all the research before I can actually sit down and write something that makes sense.
And as you were, composing the piece and maybe working back and forth with Jonah, what were some challenges that were unique to this story? Little speed bumps along the way that, that you were able to iron out.
I mean, I think Jonah's impulse to put me in sort of first person earlier in the story, that was a big deal. It helped with the setup of the piece. I'm trying to think of the challenge of it. Figuring out how to write a fair piece about a guy who didn't want to talk very much. That was challenging. And there were a lot of ways that we did it. One of them was like, we didn't actually pull him out of the shadows until about halfway through the piece. And that felt right for a reader. It was convenient for me, but also it felt right for the reader because you're sort of seeing this thing through the perspective of the cops who are trying to figure it out. And then the police and the FBI get eyes on Flynn and his crew, and you're starting to see them at a distance. And then after a while, I wound up talking to him, right? And so that was the way the reporting worked and the case unfolded. And it happened to be a really good structure for the story too. And just little things like working through what I actually knew about him and what I didn't. And then what if he tells me something that's really interesting, but there's no way I can prove, right? Like there are things he said that we did include, even though we couldn't prove it, because we realized like, oh, we can actually show that this guy isn't generally a liar. Like, because the things he's told me of the stuff I can like research, everything lines up with exactly the way he told me. So it takes other things he said and makes them more credible. You have to say, like, I don't know if this is true. He told me he burned maybe upwards of 200 paintings that he wasn't able to sell. No way to prove that. But I actually also don't have a reason to disbelieve him because there's so many other things he told me that I was able to prove, And
when you're doing the research or the writing or the rewriting and the rewriting and the rewriting, what are the places maybe on that map where you feel most kind of alive and engaged? The thing you love the most about doing this kind of storytelling?
Oh, beginnings and ends. Mm-hmm. Beginnings and ends are the best. I mean, they're the worst because you can obsess, and spend so much time writing the beginning of something, and middles suck. It's like beginnings are fun. I love writing like imagining, like, because it's like it's the only time you have where there's no preconceived ideas. You can just like hit with something that feels powerful, right? And the end is a chance to sort of have the final word, right? So those are the most fun to write. I kind of hate it when people say that writing is fun. It's not. Like, it's not fun. Like, it's what I am driven to do. And sometimes it's like satisfying. It's very rarely fun, even though I love it, but if anything's close to being fun, it's like writing a good open, that's for sure. And then in the middle, it's the worst. It's the worst because it's very easy to know where you want to start and where you want to land. And at some point in the middle, it's like, God, there's a lot of facts and God, there's a lot of stuff that happened. And how do we hone in on what? And so it winds up being this mess of stuff that an editor has to look at and be like, this stuff isn't interesting, this stuff isn't important, this is what I want to hear more of. And then as you kind of hack that stuff away, the middle gets a lot clearer.
Do you find the middle gets clearer when you have, at least in your mind, a very crystallized ending? Kind of like a lighthouse in the distance, and you're like, oh, I can see it. So now things are starting to inform that ending. Yeah,
totally. And you also have to know what the story is about. You do have to kind of establish early on, okay, there's like, here's the thing that's going to happen here. This is a story about an art heist, right? Like that's pretty clear. But you have to know what the bigger thing is that this is about. And that's what Jonah and I honed in on over a while. It was clear that Ray Flynn was a unique thief, and the line we wound up coming with up about him was the hardest working art thief. You know, as people talk about the greatest, right? So I think, which I think is kind of a bullshit idea, but this guy worked. It was a job. It was a career. So like having that beginning and then knowing what it's really about, you can't know where you're landing until you know the about. So it's like those are the sort of three pieces that make the middle clear, because then it becomes like, how are we getting to that eventually? You know, and you can find stuff that's like, this is really kind of superfluous. Like it's not getting us to the bigger picture point that we want to get to.
Yeah, at what point in the process of the research or even maybe the writing did that capital A about crystallize for you?
Probably about halfway. Like I said, like I've been thinking about this story for so long and I've pitched it so many times and I've had the benefit of like working with other smart editors and people who take in pitches to talk about it. Which a lot of times you send a pitch and you just don't hear anything, right? This one has been worked over so many times. And that about always, like the arc was always pretty clear, but the about changed over time. And probably when I came into working with Jonah and the Atavist, the about was something along the lines of like, this is an untold story and it runs contrary to what we typically think of as an art heist, right? Not one big one, but like 500 small ones. So that was enough to kind of get an editor interested. But then that became less interesting the more we wrote. And it was like, but what is it about this guy? So we knew there was something about him that was the about. And then it took a long time to get that like one word, you know, like hard working. And it's like, yeah, that feels true. I don't want to call him the greatest. I don't want to call him a genius, but like this was his job. There was a work element to it, and that felt unique. It sounds a little humdrum. He was hardworking, but when you say hardworking thief, then it's like, oh yeah, I'm kind of in now.
Yeah, it's like he saw it as a craft.
I thought about him. I wanted to be very careful to not like glamorize. It's very easy to like glamorize stealing art, you know, like because that's everybody's predisposition. But I did think about him as a craftsman. Like, I mean, the way he talked about it was always, I just never got the sense that in the times I've spoken with him that he was bragging, you know. It was just like, I'd be like, oh, I read this in this FBI document. And he'd be like, no, it wasn't like that. It was like, here's, you know, like it was a very practical way of approaching things, you know, and he just got very good at this thing. I'm not saying he thought of it as a craft or something like that or an art form or something, but there was an element of like, oh, you got good at this. You figured out how to do this well. And that is what a craft is, you know, it's like repeating something until you can do it well and even like assess other people's work. You know, like I had an interesting conversation with Ray once about the Gardner Museum robbery, which is considered like, quote, the greatest robbery in history. Boston, you know, Rembrandt's stolen 1990, all this stuff's never come back. And Ray said the people who did the Gardner were not professional. And it was like, yes, that is 100% right, because it was a mess. It was stupid to steal major works that everybody was always going to be looking for. They ripped them off the wall, smashed glass, like cut the frames. That's not professional, was Ray Flynn's perspective. It's professional to do it well, not damage the art, and then get paid. You know, like that was his opinion.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, Jack, this story was just a lot of fun and really illuminating, and just it was a good rollicking read. And so I just, as I bring these conversations down for a landing, I love just asking the guests for a recommendation of some kind. That's just anything you're excited about that you want to share with the listeners that's bringing you a little bit of joy. So I would extend that to you, Jack.
Anything meaning like story?
Could be a story. It could be a really good candy bar or a brand of socks or fanny pack, or it can be anything, man.
Oh, man. What am I enjoying right now? I am, this is very literary, but like my wife and I have been watching. Netflix had a series on 100 Years of Solitude. They you know, the Marquez book. It is my favorite all-time book, and it's one of those things that it's like, man, they better have gotten this right. And it is magical. It's so good, and it's, I don't know, I just love it. I love it. It's like you really get dropped into this world, and I don't usually feel that way about a book turned into something, especially a book I really like. You know,
For sure.
that
that's
that
awesome.
and my dog. I've been enjoying Zuzu a lot lately.
Oh, nice. Fantastic. Oh, well, Jack, well, thank you so much for carving out some time to come on the show and talk some shop around this amazing story you've written for the Atavist. So thanks for the time, and thanks for the work, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yes. Awesome. Thanks to Jonah. Thanks to Jack. Magazine.atavist.com. That's where you're going to find the story. And maybe consider subscribing to the Atavist. It's $25 for a year, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. It's really amazing. And no, I don't get any kickbacks. So don't think that I'm pushing subs because I get a commission. I get nothing. Yeah. So stay wild, see you nevers. And if you can't do, interview. See ya.